Close your eyes and imagine a January night in 1348 at Windsor Castle. A lady-in-waiting in Queen Philippa's household lies in a massive wooden bed draped with heavy wool curtains. The stone walls surrounding her chamber are 3 feet thick, built to withstand sieges, not to hold warmth. Outside the narrow window, snow falls silently onto the frozen Thames below. Inside, her breath creates small clouds in the candlelit darkness. She wears a linen chemise, 2 wool undergowns, and thick woolen hose that reach to her thighs. Beside her, 2 other ladies sleep pressed close, not for intimacy, but for survival. The fire in the chamber's single fireplace died hours ago, reduced to glowing embers that provide more light than heat. Her feet, despite the wool stockings and the heated stones that were placed at the foot of the bed before she retired, are growing cold again. She pulls the fur coverlet made from dozens of rabbit pelts sewn together closer to her chin, careful not to disturb the women sleeping beside her. She wonders, as she wonders every winter night, whether the cold will ease enough for sleep, or whether she'll lie awake until dawn, listening to the wind howl through the shutters, and feeling grateful simply to have survived another freezing night in the most luxurious palace in England. This is not a tale of peasants huddling in hovels. This is the reality of queens, princesses, duchesses, and noblewomen, women who wore silk and ermine, who dined on swan and venison, who were attended by dozens of servants, and who still, despite all their wealth and power, fought the same battle every winter night, the battle to stay warm enough to sleep, to survive until spring, to protect themselves and their children from a cold that could kill as surely as any sword. Tonight, this story will take us inside that world, showing exactly how medieval royal families, the wealthiest, most privileged people of their age, survived winter nights in palaces that were magnificent, imposing, and breathtakingly, bone-achingly cold. Before you settle in completely, take a quiet moment to like this video and subscribe. It helps this channel continue bringing calm stories from the past into your nights. And as you get comfortable, leave a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is there right now. Then, lower the lights, relax your shoulders, and stay here with me a moment longer as the story slowly begins. Medieval castles and palaces were not designed for comfort. They were built as fortresses, as symbols of power, as defensive strongholds that could withstand months-long sieges. Every architectural decision prioritized security over warmth, military strength over domestic ease. The very features that made these structures impregnable also made them almost impossible to heat. The stone walls that stopped battering rams and catapult stones also trapped cold like a tomb. The vast scale that impressed visitors and intimidated enemies created cavernous spaces where heat rose uselessly toward vaulted ceilings 40 feet overhead, dissipating into darkness while the people below shivered. The narrow arrow-slit windows that protected defenders from incoming arrows also blocked sunlight and warmth, leaving chambers in perpetual gloom even on the brightest winter days. Windsor Castle in the 14th century was a masterpiece of military architecture and a nightmare of domestic living. The walls measured 3 feet thick in most places, 5 feet thick in the defensive towers. Stone, limestone, and chalk quarried from the surrounding countryside formed every surface: walls, floors, ceilings, staircases. This stone possessed tremendous thermal mass, meaning it absorbed heat or cold slowly and released it just as slowly. In winter, once the stone chilled, it stayed cold for months, radiating a bone-deep chill that no amount of fire could fully counter. Walk through Windsor's corridors in January and the cold seeped up from the floor through leather shoe soles, through wool stockings, into the very bones of feet and legs. Touch a wall and the stone felt like ice, drawing warmth from any hand foolish enough to make contact. Stand in any chamber and feel the draft, not just one draft, but multiple currents of cold air moving through gaps around doors, through spaces where shutters met window frames, through the very weave of tapestries hung on walls, through floor seams and ceiling joints and 1,000 tiny imperfections in construction. The scale of royal palaces compounded the heating problem exponentially. Westminster Palace, the primary residence of English monarchs in London, covered more than 13 acres. Windsor Castle sprawled across 13 acres within its walls, with dozens of separate buildings, hundreds of rooms, endless corridors and staircases and halls. Heating such a space comprehensively was not merely difficult, it was impossible with medieval technology. Even the wealthiest royal household, even with access to entire forests for firewood, could not generate enough heat to warm more than a fraction of these vast cold spaces. The Great Hall might be tolerably warm during evening meals when the central fire roared and hundreds of bodies pressed together. The royal bedchambers might achieve something approaching comfort, with fires tended constantly and every warming technique employed. But the corridors between, the staircases, the chapels, the offices, the storage rooms, the countless chambers used occasionally or not at all, these stayed cold from November through March, their stone surfaces coated with frost on the coldest nights, their air so frigid that water left in basins overnight froze solid. The absence of effective chimneys in early medieval construction made matters worse. Before the 13th century, most chambers had no fireplaces at all. Central hearths in great halls vented smoke through holes in the roof or through wooden louvers that could be opened and closed. Private chambers, when they had heat sources at all, used brazier, metal bowls filled with hot coals that provided minimal warmth and filled rooms with smoke and the constant risk of fire. Only gradually, over centuries, did the technology of the wall fireplace and chimney develop and spread. By the 14th century, important chambers in major palaces boasted fireplaces cut into stone walls with chimneys that carried smoke upward and outward. But these innovations remained expensive and limited. Many rooms still had no dedicated heat source. Many fireplaces, even when present, drafted poorly, sending as much smoke into the room as up the chimney. The choice often came down to freezing in clean air or choking in smoky warmth. But why did royalty live this way? Why not build smaller, more easily heated residences? Why endure such discomfort when they possess the wealth to choose otherwise? The answer lay in the nature of medieval power itself. A king or queen was not merely a person, they were an institution, a symbol, the embodiment of divine authority and earthly might. Their residence had to reflect that reality. A palace had to impress, to intimidate, to demonstrate wealth and power so overwhelming that rebellion became unthinkable and foreign rulers thought twice before declaring war. Scale mattered, stone mattered, height and thickness and massive gates and imposing towers, all of these communicated strength, permanence, legitimacy. To live in a small, easily heated house would diminish royal dignity. To appear weak, to invite challenges from ambitious nobles who might begin to think themselves the equal of a monarch who lived no better than they did. So queens shivered in drafty stone chambers because those chambers sat within palaces that declared to all who saw them, "Here lives power that cannot be challenged, authority that cannot be questioned, majesty that towers over common humanity like these towers over the surrounding countryside." Furthermore, medieval royal courts were not private households. They were political centers, administrative hubs, judicial seats, and military headquarters all combined. Hundreds of people lived and worked within palace walls, nobles and servants, clerks and soldiers, courtiers and craftsmen, petitioners and prisoners. Managing this human hive required vast amounts of space for sleeping, working, storing supplies, conducting ceremonies, hearing legal cases, hosting diplomatic receptions, and maintaining the complex machinery of medieval governance. The palace had to function as a fortress, government office, warehouse, barracks, chapel, and home simultaneously. Comfort in such a context became a secondary concern at best. The building served functions far more important than keeping its inhabitants warm. If the queen was cold at night, well, that was unfortunate but acceptable. As long as the palace walls stood strong, as long as the throne room impressed foreign ambassadors, as long as the towers could be defended and the dungeons could hold prisoners, the palace fulfilled its purpose. Personal comfort was a luxury that power could not always afford. The temperature inside Windsor Castle during a winter night in 1348 is difficult to calculate precisely. Medieval people did not have thermometers, but historical evidence and modern research into period buildings provide estimates. In chambers with active fires, temperatures likely ranged between 45 and 55 degrees Fahrenheit, perhaps climbing to 60 near the hearth itself. In chambers without fires, temperatures probably hovered just above freezing, perhaps 35 to 40 degrees. In the coldest spaces, corridors, staircases, chambers, and outer walls, temperatures could drop below freezing, especially during severe winter weather. For comparison, modern building codes recommend indoor temperatures between 68 and 72 degrees for human comfort and health. Medieval royalty lived in conditions that modern people would consider dangerously cold, conditions that would violate every contemporary housing standard, conditions that led directly to illness, death, and constant misery for large portions of the year. And yet, they survived. They adapted. They developed strategies, technologies, and social practices that allowed human life to continue in these frozen stone fortresses. Understanding those strategies reveals not just how they stayed warm, but how they understood their bodies, their environment, and their place in a world that offered no easy comfort and demanded constant vigilance against the cold. But medieval royalty were not helpless against the cold, even if they could not truly defeat it. Royal households developed elaborate, expensive, and surprisingly sophisticated strategies for surviving winter. Every aspect of preparing for sleep on a winter night involved rituals refined over centuries, materials procured at great cost, and knowledge passed down from mother to daughter, from queen to princess, from chamberlain to maid. The process of going to bed in a medieval palace was not a simple matter of lying down and closing one's eyes. It was a complex operation involving multiple people, specific equipment, careful timing, and techniques designed to create and preserve every possible bit of warmth in the long frozen hours between dusk and dawn. The evening meal at Windsor Castle ended around 7 o'clock on a winter night, but the household did not immediately disperse to cold bedchambers. Instead, the court lingered in the great hall for another hour or two, reluctant to leave the warmest space in the entire palace. The Great Hall represented medieval heating technology at its most effective. Unlike smaller chambers with wall fireplaces, the Great Hall featured a central hearth, a massive fire pit constructed in the center of the stone floor, open on all sides, capable of burning logs 6 feet long and 2 feet thick. Servants fed this fire continuously from mid-afternoon through late evening, consuming enormous quantities of wood, but generating genuine, substantial heat that radiated outward in all directions. The fire alone, impressive as it was, could not have warmed the Great Hall adequately. The hall at Windsor measured approximately 100 feet long by 40 feet wide, with a ceiling that soared 40 feet overhead, a volume of space too vast for any single heat source to warm. But the fire did not work alone. By evening, the hall contained perhaps 200 people, the royal family and their immediate attendants on the raised dais at one end, nobles and knights at tables along the walls, servants moving between tables with food and drink, musicians in the gallery, dogs sprawling near the fire hoping for scraps. 200 human bodies, each generating heat, each breathing warm air, created a collective warmth that combined with the fire's output to raise the hall's temperature to something approaching genuine comfort. For these few precious hours, the people gathered in the great hall were almost warm. Not perfectly warm, not warm as modern people understand the term, but warm enough that fingers could move with full dexterity, warm enough that conversation flowed easily without teeth chattering, warm enough that the cold retreated from immediate awareness to a distant reminder lurking at the edges of consciousness. The contrast between the great hall and the rest of the palace made leaving difficult. Everyone present knew what awaited them. The moment they left the fire, left the press of bodies, left this pocket of warmth carved from the winter night, they would step back into the cold. Not the brutal outdoor cold, but the relentless indoor cold that pervaded every other space in the palace. Still, social hierarchy and custom dictated the evening's end. When Queen Philippa rose to retire, her ladies-in-waiting rose with her. When the queen departed, lesser nobles began their own retreats to chambers scattered throughout the palace complex. The great hall slowly emptied, the crowd thinning, the collective warmth dissipating, until only servants remained to bank the fire and clear the tables before seeking their own cold sleeping spaces in attics, in chambers off the kitchen, in any corner they could claim. The queen's procession to her chambers followed prescribed routes through the palace. From the great hall, the party climbed 2 flights of stone stairs, each step radiating cold that penetrated shoe leather and wool stockings. Stone stairs in winter became treacherous not just from cold, but from condensation that froze into invisible sheets of ice on the steps' surfaces. Servants went ahead with torches and candles, providing light and watching for ice that could send an unwary person tumbling down the hard stone steps, with consequences ranging from bruises to broken bones to death. The queen moved slowly, carefully, her ladies clustered around her, everyone wrapped in heavy wool cloaks that did little to stop the cold from seeping through layers of clothing to the skin beneath. The corridor leading to the royal apartments stretched 50 feet, lined with doors to various chambers. Tapestries hung on the walls not primarily for decoration, though they were beautiful, but for insulation. The woven wool created a small buffer of air between the freezing stone and the corridor's interior, blunting the worst of the cold radiating from the walls. But tapestries could not block the drafts that flowed along the corridor like invisible rivers of ice. These drafts came from everywhere and nowhere, from gaps under doors, from spaces where tapestries did not quite meet the walls, from the fundamental impossibility of creating a truly sealed environment in a medieval building. Walking through the corridor meant wading through currents of cold air that found every exposed bit of skin, faces, necks, and the small gap between glove and sleeve. By the time the queen reached her chambers, even the short journey from the great hall had undone the warmth so carefully built up during the evening. Everyone was cold again, thoroughly cold, their fingers stiff and their faces numb and their feet aching from contact with the frozen stone floors. The queen's ladies-in-waiting shared a chamber adjacent to the queen's own bedchamber, a privilege that marked their status. Their room measured approximately 15 feet by 20 feet, with a single narrow window and one fireplace cut into the exterior wall. The glaze, with expensive glass held in place by lead strips, still admitted drafts through inevitable gaps in the medieval glazing technique. Heavy wooden shutters, when closed, blocked most of the draft, but also blocked all light, forcing a choice between freezing in the dark or freezing while able to see. The fireplace, constructed of stone with a chimney rising through the wall to vent smoke outside, had been tended all afternoon by a servant whose sole responsibility was maintaining fires in the ladies' chambers. When the ladies entered their chamber, the fire had been burning for 3 hours, consuming carefully dried logs that produced maximum heat with minimum smoke. The servant had chosen aged oak, split and stacked to dry for at least a year before use. Green wood or damp wood created too much smoke and too little heat. The 3 hours of steady burning had produced a bed of hot coals beneath the flames, and these coals radiated intense heat, but only in a small radius. Stand within 6 feet of the fireplace, and the heat felt almost too intense on the face and hands. Step back 10 feet, and the temperature dropped dramatically. Move to the corners of the chamber, 15 feet from the fire, and the cold returned as if the fire did not exist at all. The chamber's volume was simply too great, and the stone walls absorbed too much heat for a single fireplace to warm the entire space. The best the fire could achieve was creating a warm zone near the hearth and taking the sharpest edge off the cold elsewhere in the room. The bed, positioned against an interior wall to avoid the worst drafts from the window, dominated the chamber's far end. Medieval beds for the nobility were massive wooden structures, 7 feet long and 6 feet wide, built to accommodate multiple sleepers. The frame stood on 4 carved posts that rose 7 feet from the floor, supporting a wooden canopy overhead. The bed's construction began with its base, a lattice of thick ropes strung taut across the wooden frame in a crosshatch pattern. These ropes, made from hemp, needed periodic tightening as use and humidity caused them to stretch, hence the phrase "sleep tight," as both literal instruction and figurative wish for good rest. Upon this rope base lay a thick mattress stuffed with straw, providing basic cushioning and an initial layer of insulation from the cold air beneath the bed. Atop the straw mattress went a second, thinner mattress filled with goose down and feathers, an expensive luxury that marked this as a noblewoman's bed rather than a servant's simple straw pallet. Preparing this bed for sleeping involved a complex procedure refined through generations of cold winter nights. The first step was warming the sheets. Clean linen sheets, woven fine and bleached white as a mark of status, covered the feather mattress. Linen had the advantage of being smooth against the skin, but it also had the disadvantage of feeling shockingly cold when first touched. To address this, the chambermaid used a warming pan, a long-handled metal container, rather like a covered frying pan, that held hot coals from the fireplace. She filled the warming pan with glowing coals, closed its perforated lid to prevent ash from escaping, and carefully slid it between the sheets. Moving systematically from the foot of the bed to the pillows, she left the warming pan in each position for 30 to 60 seconds, allowing the metal to transfer heat to the linen. The goal was not to make the sheets hot, which was impossible, but to drive out the worst of the cold, raising the linen's temperature from perhaps 40 degrees to 50 or 55 degrees. This small difference mattered enormously. Slipping between sheets warmed to 55 degrees was merely uncomfortable. Slipping between sheets at 40 degrees was a shock that could prevent sleep for an hour or more, as the body struggled to warm the fabric through shivering and body heat alone. The second step was positioning bed warmers for sustained heat through the night. The most effective bed warmers were large stones, roughly the size of a person's head, that had been placed directly in the kitchen fires hours earlier. By evening, these stones had absorbed tremendous heat, becoming almost too hot to touch even through thick cloth. The kitchen servants wrapped each stone in multiple layers of wool, creating a thick insulating bundle, and carried them carefully to the bedchambers. The chambermaid positioned 3 heated stones in the bed, one at the very foot where 3 pairs of feet would rest, and one on each side where bodies would lie. These stones would radiate warmth for hours, not enough to heat the entire bed, but enough to create warm spots, islands of comfort in the cold expanse of linen and wool. In the deepest hours of night, when the fire had died to ash and the chamber's temperature dropped toward freezing, those stones might be the only warmth available, and the sleepers would press their feet against them desperately, seeking any remnant of heat. The third step was layering the bed coverings in the precise order that experience had proven most effective. Over the bottom linen sheet came 3 heavy wool blankets, each woven so tightly that individual threads were barely visible. These blankets weighed perhaps 5 pounds each, and their weight itself provided comfort. The pressure created a sense of security and helped hold heat close to the body. Over the blankets went the most expensive bed covering, a fur coverlet made from dozens of rabbit pelts sewn together with careful seams. Rabbit fur was abundant and relatively affordable compared to ermine or fox, but it was also remarkably effective insulation. The chambermaid positioned this coverlet with the fur side facing down toward the sleepers, so the soft fur would lie directly against their woolen nightclothes. The fur created thousands of tiny air pockets that trapped heat radiating from the bodies beneath, preventing it from escaping upward into the cold room. Over the rabbit fur went a final coverlet made of silk, dyed in rich colors and embroidered with the Queen's heraldic symbols. This layer served more for display than warmth, showing any visitor to the chamber that these were women of status, even though the silk provided negligible insulation. But the true genius of the medieval bed, the feature that transformed it from a cold wooden platform into a survivable sleeping space, was the curtains. Heavy wool fabric, woven in patterns of red and gold, hung from an iron frame attached to the 4 bedposts. When drawn closed, these curtains enclosed the bed completely on all sides and overhead, creating a small, dark, private space within the larger cold chamber. This enclosed space measured approximately 7 feet long by 6 feet wide by 5 feet from mattress to canopy, a volume of perhaps 200 cubic feet. This was the space that 3 sleeping women had to warm with their body heat, and this relatively small volume made that task achievable in a way that warming the entire chamber would never be. The curtains blocked drafts from the window and door, prevented the warmth generated by sleeping bodies from escaping into the room, and created a microclimate that could be 10 or even 15 degrees warmer than the chamber outside. Without these curtains, sleeping through a winter night in a medieval palace would have been nearly impossible. With them, it became merely difficult and uncomfortable rather than life-threatening. Modern people often imagine that historical sleepwear involved minimal clothing, perhaps a light nightgown, or in warmer eras and climates, nothing at all. Medieval winter sleeping arrangements shattered this assumption completely. The ladies preparing for bed in their chamber did not undress in any meaningful sense. They removed outer layers, yes, but they added other layers specifically designed for sleeping warmth. The process was less about undressing and more about changing from daytime cold weather clothing to nighttime cold weather clothing. The removal process began with the outermost garments. Each lady removed her heavy wool cloak, the surcoat that provided her gown's distinctive silhouette, and the structured undergown that created fashionable lines. These garments went into wooden chests, carefully folded to preserve their shape and prevent excessive wrinkling. But beneath these outer layers, each woman wore a long linen chemise, the undergarment that had been against her skin all day, absorbing sweat and protecting the expensive wool gowns from body oils. This chemise was not removed. It stayed on, providing a base layer that would remain throughout the night. Over the chemise, each lady now pulled on a woolen nightgown. Not the thin, decorative nightgowns of later centuries, but a garment of serious warmth. These nightgowns were made from tightly woven wool, often lined with an additional layer of linen for comfort against the skin. They fell to the ankles, with long sleeves that reached the wrists. The neck was high, covering the throat and preventing heat loss from this vulnerable area. Some nightgowns buttoned or tied at the wrists and neck to prevent drafts from entering at these openings. The nightgown's purpose was not modesty. The ladies would be sharing a bed, and privacy was not a meaningful concept in medieval aristocratic life, but pure thermal protection. Wool's insulating properties, even when woven into fabric, provided crucial warmth that linen alone could not match. The head required special attention. Medieval medical theory, derived from ancient Greek and Roman sources, held that the head was particularly vulnerable to cold, and that illness often entered the body through an uncovered head. Whether or not this theory was medically accurate, the practical reality was that an uncovered head lost tremendous amounts of heat. Modern research shows that up to 40% of body heat can escape through the head and neck.
The ladies addressed this by wearing linen caps to bed, tied securely under the chin to prevent them from slipping off during sleep. These caps covered the ears completely and extended down to cover the neck's sides, leaving only the face exposed. Some women, particularly older ladies or those suffering from winter illnesses, wore caps lined with wool or even fur for extra warmth. Hair remained braided tightly against the scalp. Loose hair might seem warmer, but it was more likely to tangle during the night, and the morning process of combing out tangles in a freezing chamber was torture. Better to leave the hair in its daytime braids and deal with it properly in the slightly warmer hours after dawn. The feet and legs presented perhaps the greatest challenge for nighttime warmth. Feet, being farthest from the heart, received the least blood flow and cooled fastest. Cold feet made sleep nearly impossible, causing the whole body to feel cold even if the torso remained relatively warm. The ladies addressed this by keeping their wool hose on throughout the night. These were not the thin, decorative stockings of later eras, but thick knitted or woven wool that extended from the toes to mid-thigh, held in place by garters tied just above the knee. Some women wore 2 pairs of hose in the coldest weather, layering thinner hose beneath thicker ones. The combination of wool against the skin, wool covering from the feet to the thighs, and the heated stones positioned at the foot of the bed created enough warmth to prevent the dangerous numbness that could lead to frostbite in extreme cold. The final preparation was drinking something hot. A servant brought cups of wine that had been heated at the fire, infused with spices, cinnamon, cloves, ginger, pepper, that medieval people believed generated warmth in the body. Modern understanding suggests that alcohol actually decreases core body temperature by dilating blood vessels and increasing heat loss. But the immediate sensation of warmth and the psychological comfort of the ritual were valuable regardless of the physiological reality. The ladies drank slowly, sitting near the fire, delaying the moment when they would have to leave its warmth and climb into the bed. The hot liquid spread through their stomachs and chests, creating a temporary glow of warmth that would fade within an hour, but might last long enough to help them fall asleep.
And then, finally, the moment could be delayed no longer. The chambermaid pulled back the bed curtains, revealing the carefully prepared sleeping space. Each lady climbed onto the high bed, so high that a small wooden step was necessary, and positioned herself on the warmed sheets. The sleeping arrangement followed a pattern developed through experience. The youngest lady, least able to withstand cold, took the center position, where she would be warmed by bodies on both sides. The 2 older ladies flanked her, and all 3 arranged themselves on their sides, pressed close together in a line. This position maximized shared warmth, each woman's back against the next woman's front, sharing breath and body heat, creating a collective warmth greater than any individual could generate alone. Their feet sought the heated stone at the bed's foot, pressing against it through wool stockings, absorbing every bit of warmth it offered. The chambermaid drew the bed curtains closed, enclosing the 3 women in wool-filtered darkness. She ensured the curtains overlapped properly, with no gaps that would admit drafts. She checked that the fire had enough wood to burn for another hour. She placed the warming pan, emptied of coals, beside the fireplace for use again tomorrow night. And then she left, closing the chamber door behind her, heading to her own much less comfortable sleeping space in the servants' quarters. Inside the enclosed bed, the 3 ladies lay in darkness, listening to each other's breathing, feeling the warmth begin to build slowly in the small space their bodies shared. The sheets, pre-warmed but cooling now, still felt cold against any patch of skin that touched them directly. The rabbit fur coverlet, pressed down by the weight of wool blankets above and bodies below, created a surprisingly effective barrier against the cold. The heated stone at their feet radiated warmth that was almost painful in its intensity at first, but would become desperately sought after in the hours before dawn. And gradually, slowly, as exhaustion overcame discomfort and body heat accumulated in the enclosed space, sleep came.
Not the deep, peaceful sleep of warmth and safety, but the fitful, half-aware sleep of people who knew they would wake multiple times before morning, who knew that comfort was a temporary illusion, and who had learned through countless winter nights to accept whatever rest they could get and be grateful they had survived another day in the frozen palace.
But sleep, when it came, was not the end of the night's challenges. The medieval night was long, perhaps 14 hours of darkness in the depths of winter, and the battle against cold continued through every one of those hours. The fire that provided a measure of warmth during the evening would die to ash by midnight. The heated stones that made the bed tolerable would cool to mere rocks by the early morning hours. The body's own heat, shared between three sleepers, would have to sustain them through the coldest part of the night when the temperature inside the chamber dropped toward freezing. And the needs of the body itself, the need to urinate, the need to shift position, the need to check on the fire or adjust the bed coverings, would wake even the deepest sleeper multiple times before dawn finally arrived. The night in a medieval palace was not a peaceful rest. It was a series of small battles fought hour by hour, a constant negotiation between the body's needs and the environment's hostility, a test of endurance that every person in the palace faced, and that some, particularly the very young and very old, did not always survive. Sleep in a medieval palace was never continuous. The body, even in exhaustion, remained aware of the cold as a kind of background threat that pulled sleepers back to consciousness at regular intervals through the night. The first waking typically came around midnight, 2 or 3 hours after the ladies had climbed into bed. The fire that had been burning steadily when they retired had consumed its fuel and collapsed into a bed of coals that glowed dimly in the darkness. Without flames, the fire's heat output dropped dramatically. The temperature in the chamber, which had perhaps reached 55 degrees during the evening, began its slow descent toward the outdoor temperature. By midnight, the chamber likely hovered around 45 degrees. By the deepest part of the night, it would drop further, perhaps to 40 degrees, or even below if the weather outside turned particularly severe. One of the ladies woke first, perhaps the oldest, whose sleep was lightest, or perhaps the youngest, whose body was least tolerant of the increasing cold. She lay still for a moment, reluctant to move, assessing whether the cold was truly bad enough to warrant leaving the relative warmth of the bed. The bed's interior, enclosed by curtains and warmed by three bodies pressed together, maintained a temperature perhaps 15 degrees higher than the chamber outside, maybe 60 degrees, tolerably cool rather than actively cold. But the fire needed attention. Left to die completely, it would take far longer to relight in the morning, requiring someone to journey to the kitchen for hot coals to restart it. Better to add wood now, while coals still glow, maintaining the fire through the night, even if only at a low level. The decision was made. She began the unpleasant process of leaving the bed. This required disturbing her companions, carefully extracting herself from the tangle of bodies and blankets without letting too much cold air into the enclosed space. She pushed back the heavy coverlets, wool blankets, and rabbit fur that had trapped warmth around the sleepers, and immediately felt the cold rush in to replace the warmth her body had created. She parted the bed curtains and slipped through the opening, pulling them closed quickly behind her to preserve the warmth for the women still sleeping. Her feet, covered in wool hose, touched the chamber floor, and the cold struck through the fabric as if it were nothing. The stone floor, which never truly warmed even in summer, had spent the past hours radiating its chill into the room. Walking on it barefoot would have been acutely painful. Even through wool stockings, the cold was intense enough to make her feet ache within seconds. The chamber was dark except for the faint red glow of the dying fire. The window shutters, closed against the night, blocked all outside light. She moved carefully toward the fireplace, hands outstretched to avoid bumping into furniture, guided by the dim glow of the coals. The fire tools, iron poker and tongs, lay beside the hearth where the servant had left them. She used the poker to stir the coals, breaking up the ash layer that had formed on top and exposing the still hot embers beneath.
The coals glowed brighter with the addition of oxygen, radiating a wave of heat that felt almost painful against her face after the cold of the room. From the wood basket beside the hearth, she selected 2 pieces of split oak, dry and ready to burn. She positioned them carefully on the coals, giving them space to catch, waiting to see the first wisps of smoke that would indicate the wood was beginning to burn. The entire process took perhaps 5 minutes, but those 5 minutes standing on the frozen floor in her woolen nightgown left her thoroughly chilled. Her hands, which had been warm beneath the bed covers, were now stiff with cold. Her feet ached. The parts of her face exposed to the air, forehead, cheeks, and nose, felt numb. She lingered a moment by the reviving fire, letting some warmth seep back into her hands and feet, but she could not stay long. The bed, for all its imperfect warmth, was far more tolerable than standing in the freezing chamber. She returned to the bed, parted the curtains, and climbed back in, trying to minimize the cold air she admitted with her entry. The other ladies stirred, murmuring complaints about the cold draft, then settled again as she arranged herself back into position and pulled the covers over all 3 of them. The bed's interior temperature had dropped during her absence, perhaps 5 degrees lost in 5 minutes, and it would take another 20 or 30 minutes of shared body heat to bring the enclosed space back to its previous tolerable coolness. She lay awake for that time, shivering slightly, listening to the fire crackle as the new logs caught, waiting for warmth to return and sleep to reclaim her. The second waking came harder, and for a reason that could not be ignored. The human body, even in sleep, continues its processes of digestion and waste elimination. Medieval people, like modern people, needed to urinate during the night. But in a medieval palace, answering this need involved challenges that modern people with indoor plumbing can scarcely imagine.
The chamber contained a chamber pot, a ceramic vessel kept in a corner of the room, sometimes enclosed in a wooden box with a lid to contain odors. Using this pot required leaving the bed, walking across the freezing floor, squatting over the cold ceramic in the frigid air, and then returning to bed. The alternative was suffering through the night with increasing discomfort, risking bladder infections or accidents. Neither option was pleasant. Around 3 or 4 in the morning, one of the ladies woke up with the urgent need to urinate. She lay for some minutes trying to ignore the pressure, trying to will herself back to sleep, but the body's demands eventually overcame reluctance. She extracted herself from the bed, more difficult now as the other women were deeply asleep and tangled together more tightly, and emerged into the chamber. The fire she had fed hours earlier had burned down again, providing only faint light. The temperature in the chamber had dropped further, perhaps to 40 degrees or slightly below. Her breath created visible clouds in the dim firelight. The floor was so cold that her feet cramped with pain within seconds of touching the stone. She found the chamber pot by memory and position, lifted the wooden lid, and quickly did what was necessary. The ceramic pot itself was cold enough to be uncomfortable against bare skin, adding one more small misery to the experience. When finished, she replaced the lid, essential to prevent odors from spreading through the chamber, and hurried back to the bed as quickly as the darkness and her cold, cramped feet allowed. Climbing back into the bed brought a mixed experience of relief and renewed cold. The interior of the bed curtains had cooled during her absence, though it was still warmer than the chamber outside. Her body, chilled from exposure to the room's cold air, would take time to warm again. She pressed close to the other sleepers, seeking their body heat, and tried to find sleep again while shivering under the covers. This pattern of waking, leaving the bed for some necessity, returning to the bed, and struggling to warm up again, repeated throughout the night for medieval sleepers. The very young and very old sometimes could not manage the journey to the chamber pot, especially on the coldest nights. Chamber accidents were not uncommon and carried no particular shame. Everyone understood the difficulty of navigating a freezing room in darkness multiple times per night. The soiled linens would be changed in the morning, washed in cold water by servants who had their own battles with winter cold, and life would continue. Dignity was a luxury, like warmth, that winter did not always permit.
The hours between 3 and 6 in the morning were the coldest of the night. Outside, the temperature reached its lowest point just before dawn. Inside, the accumulated cold of the stone walls and floors peaked during these hours. The fire, no matter how carefully tended, burned low or died completely. The heated stones that had provided such comfort earlier in the night cooled to mere rocks, offering no more warmth than any other object in the bed. The ladies' body heat alone had to sustain them through these hours, and body heat, while substantial when shared between 3 people in an enclosed space, was barely sufficient to prevent serious discomfort. The ladies woke frequently during these hours, never quite achieving deep sleep. They shifted positions constantly, seeking warmer spots in the bed, pressing closer together, arranging and rearranging the blankets and furs to cover gaps where cold air penetrated. The rabbit fur coverlet, which had seemed so effective earlier, now felt inadequate as the cold worked its way through every layer. Feet, being furthest from the torso and most exposed to the cold air at the bottom of the bed, suffered especially. Even wearing 2 layers of wool hose, feet could become painfully cold during these hours. The ladies drew their knees toward their chests, tucking their feet up under their nightgowns, curling into tight balls to minimize surface area exposed to the cold air. This position was uncomfortable for sustained sleep, but it was warmer than lying stretched out, and warmth mattered more than comfort. Some women suffered more than others during these coldest hours. Older women whose bodies generated less heat and whose circulation was poorer felt the cold more acutely. Women who were naturally thin, lacking the insulating layer of body fat that provided some protection against cold, struggled more than their heavier companions. Women who were ill or recovering from childbirth, whose bodies were already stressed, sometimes could not maintain sufficient warmth even with all the available protections. In extreme cases, especially among the elderly or the very young, hypothermia could set in during these hours. The body's core temperature would drop, leading to confusion, loss of coordination, and eventually death if not addressed. Servants checking on elderly nobles in the morning sometimes found them dead in their beds, killed not by violence or disease, but simply by cold, by the accumulation of too many cold nights in rooms that could not be adequately warmed.
But for healthy adults, even these coldest hours were survivable, if miserable. The ladies endured, half awake and uncomfortable, counting the hours by listening for the bells that marked the monastic offices. Medieval palaces and castles were built near chapels or churches, and the religious communities maintained strict schedules of prayer throughout the night. Bells rang at midnight for matins, at 3 in the morning for lauds, at 6 for prime. These bells, echoing through the cold stone corridors, provided a way to track time's passage without candles or clocks. Hearing the 3 o'clock bell meant 3 more hours until dawn, 3 more hours until the servants would come to relight fires and begin preparing for the day. Hearing the 6 o'clock bell meant dawn was approaching, meant the long night was finally ending, meant survival was assured for another day. Sleep in such conditions, fragmented and uncomfortable as it was, brought its own particular quality of dreams. Cold affected the sleeping mind in ways that warm, comfortable sleep did not. Dreams during these medieval winter nights often involved water, ice, snow, the mind processing the body's physical experience of cold through symbolic imagery. Women dreamed of falling into frozen rivers, of being trapped in snowstorms, of searching for warmth that always remained just out of reach. These dreams were vivid and disturbing, sometimes causing sleepers to cry out or thrash in their sleep, disturbing their bedmates. Medical texts from the medieval period noted that cold sleep produced an excess of phlegm, one of the 4 humors that medieval medicine believed governed health and temperament. Too much phlegm generated by cold and damp conditions was thought to cause sluggishness, sadness, and disturbing dreams. Whether or not the humor theory was medically accurate, the observation about dreams was correct. Modern research shows that body temperature significantly affects sleep quality and dream content. People sleeping in cold conditions experience more frequent waking, lighter sleep stages, and dreams with more negative emotional content. The medieval sleepers did not understand the physiological mechanisms, but they knew from experience that winter sleep was different from summer sleep, less restful, more troubled, more likely to leave them tired even after 8 or 9 hours in bed. Some women suffered from recurring nightmares during the winter months, dreams so vivid and terrifying that they dreaded going to sleep. These nightmares often involved themes of abandonment, death, or entrapment, of the mind processing the very real fear that winter brought. Winter was when food ran low, when illness struck hardest, when travel became impossible and help could not reach those in need. Winter was when children and elderly parents died, when fires went out and could not be relit, when the cold itself became an enemy that could not be fought or fled. The fears that lived quietly in the background during summer months came forward in winter, manifesting in dreams that reflected the genuine dangers that cold presented. The ladies sleeping in their shared bed sometimes comforted each other when nightmares struck. A woman crying out in her sleep would wake her bedmates, who would soothe her with quiet words, remind her where she was, and help her settle back into sleep. This mutual comfort was one of the benefits of shared sleeping arrangements. Alone, a person waking from a nightmare into the cold darkness of a medieval bedchamber faced isolation and fear. With companions, there was comfort in human presence, in voices that dispelled the nightmare's lingering emotions, in the reminder that others shared the experience and understood the fear. The shared bed was not just about physical warmth, it was also about psychological survival, about maintaining human connection through the long, dark hours when isolation might otherwise have broken the spirit, along with chilling the body.
The medieval palace at night was not silent. The ladies, lying awake in the darkness between periods of fitful sleep, heard a constant symphony of sounds that marked the passage of the night hours. The most frequent sound was the wind. Windsor Castle, built on a hill above the Thames, caught every winter wind that swept across the flat river valley. The wind howled through the battlements, whistled through arrow slits, moaned in the chimneys, and rattled the shutters. Sometimes, during particularly fierce storms, the wind was loud enough to make conversation impossible and sleep nearly so. The shutters banged against their frames despite the latches that held them closed. Tapestries flapped on the walls, doors trembled in their frames. The whole palace seemed to shudder under the wind's assault, the stone walls creaking and settling in ways that sounded ominous in the darkness. Beyond the wind came other sounds. The bells marking monastic hours, as already mentioned, rang regularly through the night. The guards on the walls called out to each other as they made their rounds, their voices carrying through the cold air. Somewhere in the palace, someone was always awake. Kitchen servants preparing bread for the next day's meals, guards maintaining their watch, grooms tending horses in the stables, nurses caring for sick children or elderly invalids. Their sound, footsteps on stone floors, voices calling instructions, doors opening and closing, created a background noise that was sometimes comforting and sometimes unsettling, depending on the listener's state of mind. Animals added their own voices to the night. Dogs, kept for hunting and protection, barked at real or imagined threats. Horses in the stables stamped and whinnied. Rats, emboldened by darkness, scurried through the walls in their endless search for food. Their scratching and squeaking was a constant presence, occasionally startling, but mostly ignored through familiarity. Medieval people lived closely with animals and accepted their noises as part of the soundscape of daily and nightly life. Sometimes the ladies heard crying, a child waking in fear or discomfort, a woman in labor in a distant chamber, someone mourning a death. Medieval life was filled with loss and suffering, and the night did not pause these experiences.
Sometimes they heard laughter or singing from the guards or servants who dealt with the long night hours through camaraderie and song. Sometimes they heard prayers, voices rising in the chapel below as the monks or priests maintained their vigils. All these sounds filtered through the stone walls, muffled but audible, reminding the ladies that they were not alone in their cold vigil, that the whole palace endured the winter night together. Dawn came slowly in a medieval winter. The sky began to lighten around 7 in the morning in January, but true sunrise did not arrive until nearly 8. The ladies, lying half awake in their bed, watched the darkness behind the closed shutters gradually shift from black to dark gray to lighter gray. The change was subtle at first, barely perceptible, but it grew more obvious as the minutes passed. Gray light began to seep around the edges of the shutters, through the tiny gaps in the wood, creating faint lines of illumination in the darkness of the chamber. The arrival of dawn brought no warmth. The outside temperature was often at its lowest just as the sun rose. But dawn brought light, and light brought hope and the promise that the night's ordeal was ending. Dawn meant servants would soon arrive to relight the fire and bring hot water for washing. Dawn meant dressing in daytime clothes and leaving the chamber for the slightly warmer great hall where breakfast would be served. Dawn meant movement and activity that would generate body heat and distract from discomfort. Most of all, dawn meant survival. Another night survived, another day gained, another small victory in the endless winter battle against cold.
Around 7:30, the ladies heard the sound they had been waiting for. Footsteps approaching the chamber door. A knock, quiet but firm. One of the ladies called permission to enter, and the chambermaid opened the door, bringing with her a rush of cold air from the corridor, but also the promise of assistance. She carried an armload of wood for the fire and a bucket of hot water heated in the kitchen. She crossed to the fireplace and began rebuilding the fire, adding small kindling to the barely alive coals, blowing gently to encourage flames, gradually adding larger pieces until a proper fire was burning again. The room began to warm slightly, at least near the hearth. The ladies rose from the bed, finally, ending the long night's vigil. They emerged from the bed curtains stiff with cold and lack of movement, their joints protesting after hours in cramped positions. They moved carefully, slowly, giving their cold muscles time to loosen. The chambermaid poured hot water into a basin for washing, not a bath, which would require far more water and preparation, but a quick washing of face and hands that served more for ritual cleanliness than thorough hygiene. The hot water was a luxury, a small comfort that marked the transition from night to day. The ladies washed quickly, the water cooling rapidly in the cold chamber, then began the process of dressing for the day.
Breakfast in the great hall was not merely about food. It was about warmth, gathering in the one reliably heated space in the palace. By 8 in the morning, the servants had been stoking the central hearth for hours, building up a fire substantial enough to provide meaningful heat to the assembled household. The ladies joined the queen and other members of the court at the trestle tables set up the previous evening, sitting on benches that had been positioned as close to the fire as safety and hierarchy allowed. The queen and her immediate family sat at the high table on the raised dais, closer to the fire than the lower tables, but even this positioning gave only marginal advantage. The great hall was large enough that heat distribution remained uneven. Those near the fire were almost too warm on the side facing the flames, while their backs remained cold. Those at the far tables felt minimal benefit from the fire and relied on body heat from the crowd to achieve any comfort at all. The meal itself contributed to warmth. Hot porridge made from oats or barley, bread fresh from the ovens and still radiating heat, weak ale that had been warmed slightly, all of these helped raise the body's core temperature. Eating was not just about nutrition, it was about generating internal heat, giving the body fuel to maintain its temperature against the constant cold. Medieval people understood this connection intuitively, if not scientifically. They ate more in winter when available, and they prioritized hot foods and drinks. The wealthy could afford to eat well through winter. The poor often could not, and their inability to maintain adequate caloric intake made them even more vulnerable to cold-related illness and death.
But breakfast could not last forever. Duties called. The Queen had administrative responsibilities, meeting with stewards, reviewing household accounts, making decisions about the palace's operation. Her ladies had their own tasks: sewing, supervising servants, caring for children, attending religious services, and maintaining the complex social relationships that governed court life. These activities took place throughout the palace, often in chambers far from the great hall's fire, and moving from the hall to these cold working spaces was a shock every single time. The body, warmed by breakfast and proximity to the fire, protested violently at the return to cold. Walking through the corridors to reach a working chamber meant enduring sharp temperature drops. The warm flush in the cheeks faded within minutes. Hands that had been flexible became stiff again. Feet that had finally warmed began to ache with renewed cold. The ladies learned to move through the palace strategically, planning routes that minimized exposure to the coldest spaces, clustering together for shared warmth, choosing chambers that received some sunlight through windows over those that remained perpetually dark. But strategy could only accomplish so much. The palace's fundamental architecture, stone walls, vast distances, minimal heating, meant that being cold was simply part of existing within its walls from November through March. The work that filled a noblewoman's day required manual dexterity that could be threatened constantly. Sewing, one of the primary activities for ladies of the court, was particularly affected by cold. Fine needlework, embroidering altar cloths, stitching decorative details on clothing, repairing torn garments, required steady hands and precise control. The cold made this difficult to the point of impossibility. Fingers lost sensation in the cold, making it hard to feel the needle and thread. Cold made fingers stiff, reducing the fine motor control needed for detailed work. Pricking fingers with needles was common in the best conditions. In the cold, when fingers were numb and clumsy, blood from needle pricks was nearly constant. The ladies developed techniques to manage these challenges. They worked in chambers with fireplaces when possible, positioning themselves as close to the heat as they could. They worked in groups, sharing body heat as they had shared it in bed, sitting close together on benches, their collective warmth making the workspace slightly more tolerable. They kept their work materials warm, storing fabric near the fire before use so it was not shockingly cold to touch. They took frequent breaks to warm their hands at the fire, holding them close to the flames until sensation and flexibility returned, then returning to work for another period before the cold drove them back to the fire again. Some tasks were simply impossible in the deepest cold. Illuminating manuscripts, painting detailed miniatures in books of hours or gospels required such fine control that artists could not work when their hands were truly cold. Scribes copying texts struggled when ink froze in the inkwells. Servants working in the kitchens dealt with water that froze in buckets, bread dough that refused to rise in the cold, butter and lard that became rock hard and nearly impossible to work with. The household adapted, shifting activities to match the temperature. Fine work happened during the warmest part of the day, usually mid-afternoon, when the sun was highest and had had time to warm south-facing chambers slightly. Coarser work, spinning wool, carding fibers, basic mending, could continue even when hands were cold, and this work filled the coldest hours.
Writing was particularly challenging. Quills had to be cut and maintained, ink had to flow smoothly, and hands had to remain steady enough to form legible letters. In cold chambers, ink thickened and flowed poorly. Quills became brittle and broke more easily. Hands cramped with cold, making letters shaky and irregular. Women writing letters to family members, keeping household accounts, or composing devotional texts struggled against these physical limitations. Some gave up during the coldest months, waiting for spring to resume correspondence. Others persisted, producing documents with shakier handwriting and more frequent errors than they would have tolerated in warmer months, but maintaining these important activities despite the cold's interference. Children suffered disproportionately from palace cold. Their smaller bodies had less thermal mass and lost heat more quickly than adults. Their developing immune systems made them more vulnerable to the respiratory infections that flourished in cold, crowded conditions. And their constant activity, running, playing, exploring, meant they could not stay near fires as reliably as adults could. Keeping children healthy through winter was one of the greatest challenges facing noble mothers and nursemaids. Infants were perhaps most vulnerable. A baby could not shiver effectively to generate heat. A baby could not communicate feeling cold until reaching the point of dangerous hypothermia. A baby's head, proportionally large compared to its body, lost tremendous amounts of heat if not kept covered. Medieval nursemaids swaddled infants tightly in layers of wool, wrapped their heads in linen caps lined with wool, and kept them close to adult bodies as much as possible. Babies slept in cradles positioned near fireplaces, though not so close as to risk burns or smoke inhalation. When mothers or nursemaids nursed babies, they often did so beneath heavy blankets or cloaks, creating a warm microenvironment for the feeding. Despite these precautions, infant mortality spiked in winter months. Babies died from respiratory infections, from cold exposure, from the general stress that winter placed on small, vulnerable bodies. Toddlers and young children presented different challenges. They had more body mass than infants and could communicate discomfort, but they were also mobile, curious, and resistant to staying near fires when they wanted to explore. Noble children's clothing in winter involved multiple layers similar to adults. Linen undergarments, wool gowns or tunics, thick wool cloaks, caps, mittens, and sturdy shoes. But children were harder to keep fully clothed. They removed mittens to use their hands. They threw off caps when they got too warm playing. They outgrew shoes and had to wear ill-fitting replacements until new ones could be made. Mothers and nursemaids fought a constant battle to keep children adequately dressed and warm, knowing that inadequate clothing could lead to illness. Children's activities were adapted for winter survival. In summer, noble children played outdoors in palace gardens and courtyards, running freely in the fresh air and sunshine. In winter, outdoor play was limited to the warmest part of the day, and even then was brief. Most play happened indoors, in chambers with fires, under adult supervision. The Great Hall became a playroom during parts of the day when it was not needed for meals or formal gatherings. Children played games, told stories, and engaged in activities that kept them moving and generated body heat while keeping them near warmth sources. Education continued through winter. Children learned letters, prayers, music, and courtly behavior, but lessons happened in heated chambers and were often shorter than in summer, acknowledging that cold made concentration difficult and that warmth had to be shared fairly among all who needed it. The most heartbreaking aspect of winter in medieval palaces was knowing that some children would not survive to see spring. Every winter brought deaths among the young, sometimes from specific illnesses like pneumonia, sometimes from the accumulated stress of months of cold, poor air quality, limited sunlight, and indoor confinement. Mothers who had raised children through several winters knew the signs of a child struggling more than usual. Listlessness, poor appetite, difficulty staying warm even with extra clothing and blankets, recurring coughs or fevers. Sometimes intervention helped, move the child to a warmer chamber, providing extra food and hot drinks, limiting exposure to cold. Sometimes these measures were not enough. Mothers sat vigil beside children who weakened through the winter, praying for spring to come soon enough, knowing that spring did not always arrive in time. The afternoon brought a slight reprieve from the worst cold. Between noon and 3 o'clock, the winter sun reached its highest point, and south-facing chambers received direct sunlight through their windows. This sunlight, even filtered through glass or oiled parchment, provided measurable warmth. Chambers that had been 40 degrees in the morning might reach 45 or even 50 degrees in the afternoon sun. This 5 or 10 degree increase was enough to make certain activities feasible that would have been impossible earlier. The Queen and her senior ladies used these warmer afternoon hours for administrative work that required concentration, reviewing household accounts, reading correspondence, making decisions about supplies and expenditures. All of these tasks demanded mental clarity that was hard to achieve when shivering with cold. The afternoon's relative warmth, combined with the midday meal that had further boosted body temperature, created a window of several hours when the mind could function more effectively. Stewards brought their reports, petitioners presented requests, and decisions were made that governed the household's operation.
Bathing, when it occurred, happened in the afternoon, if at all. Full baths were infrequent in winter, perhaps once a month for the wealthy, less often for others. The process of preparing a bath was laborious, carrying enough hot water from the kitchen fires to fill a wooden tub, maintaining the water's temperature in a cold chamber, and then disposing of the used water afterward. The bath itself, even with hot water, was an ordeal in a cold room. The body in hot water was comfortable, but any part above the water, head, shoulders, arms, while washing, was exposed to cold air and chilled rapidly. Stepping out of the bath into a cold chamber was shockingly unpleasant, and drying quickly was essential to prevent dangerous chilling. Despite these challenges, bathing did occur, driven by medieval concerns about cleanliness and health. The timing, though, was strategic. Never in the morning, when chambers were coldest, never in the evening, when there was not enough time to dry thoroughly before bed, but in the afternoon, when conditions were least hostile. The afternoon was also when outdoor activity happened, weather permitting. On days when the sun shone and the wind was calm, members of the household ventured into the courtyard for exercise and fresh air. Medieval medical theory held that fresh air was essential for health, and that too much time indoors led to illness from breathing stale air fouled by fires in many bodies. The challenge was balancing the need for fresh air against the danger of cold exposure. Short periods outdoors, 15 or 20 minutes, were considered beneficial. Longer exposure risked chilling the body too much. The ladies, wrapped in heavy cloaks, walked briskly through the courtyard or along the palace walls, then returned indoors before cold penetrated their layers of clothing. These brief outdoor excursions, though cold, provided psychological relief from the claustrophobia of constant indoor confinement and gave bodies the movement they needed to maintain health. As afternoon faded into evening and the brief winter daylight ended, the household once again gathered in the great hall. The evening meal was the day's main event, the time when everyone from the highest nobles to the lowest servants came together in shared space and shared warmth. The central fire had been burning all day and now reached its peak intensity, fed generously with wood in preparation for the evening crowd. The meal itself, roasted meats, bread, vegetables, wine, was hot and substantial, providing the calories needed to sustain the body through another cold night. But the evening meal was more than just food and warmth. It was also community, entertainment, and a reminder that winter, for all its hardship, did not stop life from continuing. Musicians played, poets recited verses, storytellers shared tales. People talked, laughed, gossiped, and maintained the social bonds that would carry them through to spring. The great hall in the evening was a respite from cold, yes, but also from the isolation and gloom that cold enforced. The warmth of the fire was matched by the warmth of human connection, and both were essential for survival.
As the evening wore on and the hour for retiring approached, the ladies felt the familiar reluctance to leave the hall's warmth. They knew what awaited them, the cold climb to their chamber, the process of preparing for bed, the long night ahead. But they also knew, from experience, that they would survive it. They had survived countless nights before. They would survive this one. Tomorrow would bring another day, another struggle against the cold, another small victory in the endless winter battle. And eventually, though it seemed impossible in January, spring would come. The cold would ease, warmth would return. Until then, they endured, because endurance was what winter demanded and what medieval people, royal and common alike, learned to provide. We have traveled through a complete cycle now, from evening preparations through the long night to the cold day and back to evening again. We have seen how medieval royal women survived in palaces built for power rather than comfort, how they created warmth through materials and methods and sheer determination, how they protected themselves and their children against an enemy that could not be fought directly but only endured. But stepping back from these daily and nightly details, what larger truths emerge? What does this history of cold endurance teach us about the lives of medieval people, about the nature of privilege and hardship, about the distance between historical imagination and historical reality? In these final minutes together, let us reflect on what we have learned and what it means for how we understand both the medieval past and our own present comfort. The story of how medieval royal families survived freezing palaces is paradoxically a story of privilege. These women were cold, yes, profoundly, constantly, sometimes dangerously cold. But they were cold in chambers with fireplaces, sleeping in beds with fur coverlets and heated stones, wearing wool clothing that represented significant expense, eating hot meals that provided the calories their bodies needed to generate warmth. Their suffering, real as it was, existed on a completely different scale from the suffering of those below them in the medieval social hierarchy. The servants who tended their fires slept in attics and cellars with no heat sources at all. The peasants in surrounding villages lived in houses with earthen floors and thatched roofs that leaked cold air through 1,000 gaps. The truly poor died in winter at rates that made noble winter mortality look negligible by comparison. Understanding this context matters. It would be easy to romanticize the past, to imagine that medieval people were somehow harder than modern people, more tolerant of cold, genetically or culturally adapted to discomfort. But this is not true. Medieval people suffered from cold exactly as modern people would suffer. They were not more resistant to frostbite, hypothermia, or the respiratory infections that cold environments promoted. What they had was not greater tolerance, but greater necessity. They could not choose warmth, so they chose survival within the cold. They developed every strategy their technology and resources allowed, and they endured what those strategies could not prevent.
The medieval women lying in their curtained beds, sharing warmth, listening to the wind, waiting for dawn, knew things about endurance, about community, about the necessity of human connection for survival that modern people often learn only in crisis. They knew that comfort is constructed, temporary, and precious. They knew that survival requires cooperation, that isolation can be fatal, that small acts of care, sharing body heat, tending fires, preparing hot drinks, can mean the difference between life and death. These lessons, while born of hardship we no longer face, remain relevant to human existence in any era. This brings us to the end of tonight's journey through medieval winter, but it does not have to be the end of our explorations together. History is filled with these hidden stories, moments of daily life that reveal truths about how people actually lived, struggled, adapted, and endured. The textbooks tell us about kings and battles and political treaties, but they often skip over the questions that make the past feel real and human. How did people actually sleep? What did they eat? How did they stay warm, stay clean, raise children, find moments of joy in circumstances we can barely imagine? These questions have answers, and those answers are worth exploring.
Here is where you come in. If you have found value in tonight's story, if it has given you a new way of thinking about medieval life or about your own comfort, I would genuinely love to hear what other stories from the past you would like to explore together. The format we have used tonight, this slow, detailed, immersive approach to a specific aspect of historical daily life, can be applied to countless topics. And the topic we explore next does not have to be my choice alone. It can be yours. So take a moment now, while the story is still fresh in your mind, and leave a comment telling me what historical scenario you would like to experience next. Be as specific as you can, because the more specific your suggestion, the richer the story can become. Do not just say Vikings or ancient Egypt. Tell me what aspect of those cultures appeals to you. Is it how Viking families survived the brutal Scandinavian winters in their longhouses with techniques different from medieval England? Is it how ancient Egyptian women managed pregnancy and childbirth in the desert heat, facing challenges as intense as cold, but opposite in nature? Is it how Byzantine empresses navigated the complex rituals of the imperial court in Constantinople, or how Japanese noblewomen in the Heian period arranged their elaborate 12-layered kimonos? Perhaps you're curious about monastery life, how monks survived their vows of poverty through winter in stone abbeys, or how they maintained their routines of midnight prayers in unheated chapels. Maybe you want to know about ships, how sailors on medieval merchant vessels or Renaissance exploration ships endured months at sea in tiny wooden vessels, or how women disguised as men served on naval ships in the age of sail. The possibilities are genuinely endless, and your curiosity can guide which stories get told.
When you leave your suggestion, tell me why that particular scenario interests you. Is it a period you have always been curious about? Is it a question that has puzzled you? Is it something you have wondered about while reading historical fiction or watching period dramas? Understanding what draws you to a particular topic helps shape how the story is told. Your interest, your curiosity, your specific questions become the foundation for the next journey we take together. I will read every comment, not just skim them, but actually read them, think about them, consider which suggestions would make the richest stories, and then I will choose one randomly from among the suggestions that appear most frequently or that seem to offer the most compelling narrative possibilities. Your comment might be the one that determines what story we explore next. Your curiosity might shape the next 45 minutes of calm, historical storytelling. That is a genuine collaboration between storyteller and listener, and it makes these stories better, more responsive to what you actually want to know, rather than just what I assume might be interesting. There is no wrong answer, no suggestion too obscure or too simple. If you are curious about how people washed their hair in ancient Rome, that is a valid topic. If you want to know how pregnant queens managed the expectations of producing heirs while dealing with medieval medical understanding, that is equally valid. If you wonder about the daily life of servants in great houses, or how people celebrated festivals in peasant villages, or what it was like to be a merchant traveling the Silk Road, or how people with disabilities navigated a world without modern accommodations, all of these have stories attached, stories that can be researched, imagined, and told in this same calm, detailed, human-centered way. And beyond just suggesting topics, tell me what resonated with you in tonight's story. Was it the specific details about bed warmers and curtains? Was it understanding the temperature differences throughout the palace? Was it the recognition of how privileged we are to have warmth? Was it the part about mothers worrying over cold children?
Knowing what landed most powerfully helps craft future stories that will resonate in similar ways. Your feedback does not just help choose the next topic, it helps shape how that topic is approached, what details are emphasized, what human truths are highlighted. This channel exists because people like you listen, engage, and care about these stories of daily life from the past. Without your presence here tonight, these medieval women and their frozen palaces would remain just a footnote in history, a brief mention that medieval castles were cold, without any real understanding of what that cold meant for actual human lives. You have given these women attention and empathy across the centuries. You have made their experience matter. And you can do the same for the next group of historical people we visit together, whoever and whenever they might be. So, leave that comment. Tell me what story you want to hear next. And while you were there, also tell me, did this story change how you think about warmth tonight? As you settle into your comfortable bed in your heated room, are you more aware of what that comfort represents? The medieval women we have spent this evening with, the ladies-in-waiting sharing their curtained bed, the mothers checking on cold children, the servants maintaining fires through the night, they would not want you to feel guilty about your warmth. They would want you to have it, to enjoy it, to appreciate it. Honoring their memory is not about recreating their hardship. It is about understanding what they endured and letting that understanding deepen your gratitude for the progress that separates their world from yours.
Tonight, you are warmer than Queen Philippa was in Windsor Castle in 1348. You are more comfortable than any medieval monarch, despite all their wealth and power. The warmth you take for granted represents centuries of human ingenuity, of technological advancement, of countless people working to solve the problem of cold that plagued our ancestors. The blanket you pull up to your chin, the heated air flowing through your vents, the insulated walls that hold warmth inside, none of these are accidents. They are achievements, built on the accumulated knowledge of generations who knew cold intimately and worked to defeat it. As you drift towards sleep tonight, you might think of those women in their frozen palace, huddled together under rabbit fur, listening to the wind howl, waiting for dawn. You might think about how far humanity has come, how much we have overcome, how much comfort we have created from a world that offered none. And you might feel, just for a moment, a connection across the centuries to those who came before, who survived their own challenges with courage and resourcefulness and humor and love, who created the foundation on which our modern comfort is built.
Their winter nights are over. Their cold has ended. But their story continues as long as we remember it, as long as we take the time to understand not just the facts of their lives, but the feeling of those lives, the texture of daily experience in a world so different from ours, yet built of the same human hopes and fears and needs. They were people, like us. They suffered like we do. They endured like we must. And they survived, creating the future that became our present. So, sleep well tonight, wrapped in warmth they could not have imagined. Sleep grateful for the comfort that separates your world from theirs. Sleep knowing that you are the answer to their struggles, the fulfillment of their hopes for a better life for those who came after. And sleep peacefully, because the cold that threatened them cannot touch you, because the long winter night they faced has ended centuries ago, because you are here, now, safe and warm and exactly where you need to be. Good night. Stay warm, and thank you for listening, for caring, for making these stories matter. I will see you in the next story, whichever one you choose.